Just to give you a brief overview of what I'm going to do, I'm going to start by grounding us in the reality of the ecological crisis, while specifically trying to highlight the colonial dimensions of this crisis. I'm going to argue that we need to understand it and our failure to address it as an effect of the underlying structure of our economic system, which is capitalism. And then if we're going to have any chance of stopping ecological breakdown, and moreover doing so in a way that is socially just, it's going to require that we liberate ourselves from the growth imperatives that bind us and ultimately transition to a post-capitalist economy. So first to the most prominent dimension of the ecological crisis, which is climate breakdown. We're presently at 1.2 degrees of global warming, and even at this level, the effects are clearly disastrous. Already, 30 million people are being displaced each year by climate breakdown, triggering major social and political upheaval. For these people, as Vina mentions, climate apocalypse is not some abstract future possibility. It's happening right now. And we know that to stay under 1.5 degrees, as per the Paris agreements, global emissions have to be cut in half by 2030, and that's the green line in this graph, declining dramatically from historical trends. But so far, government pledges are nowhere near this target. And most people are not aware of this fact, actually. But even if all countries uphold their existing pledges under the Paris agreements, global emissions will not decline at all over the coming decade. And that reality is represented here by the blue line. Moreover, right now, existing government policies have us on track for 3.2 degrees of heating, which is way over the limit. And this represents, I think we can all agree, a profound failure of our governments, a failure of our international system, and portends a very dangerous future indeed. And crucially, climate is not the only crisis that we face. And this reality tends to fall out of our dominant media discourse, I think, a little bit, but it's important. The global economy is presently overshooting several other planetary boundaries, including deforestation and habitat destruction, excess fertilizer use from industrial monoculture, water depletion due to industrial extraction, chemical pollution, and then, perhaps most concerningly, species extinction, which right now is occurring about 1,000 times faster than the background rate, the normal background rate. And when the latest UN reports on biodiversity was published, the executive secretary summarized it by saying, and I quote, "We are currently, in a systematic manner, exterminating all non-human living beings." Although I don't know if the word "we" here is very appropriate. Because here's the thing. People have a tendency to refer to this crisis in the language of the Anthropocene. And of course, this terminology is useful to highlight the fact that it's human activity that is dramatically reshaping our planet and our climate right now. But this term is also incorrect. It's not humans as such that are causing this problem. Rather, it's being driven by the particular structure of the global economic system, again, capitalism. And indeed, scholars increasingly refer to the ecological crisis in terms such as the Capitalocene. Okay? Now, it's important to be clear what we mean by capitalism here. When people think of capitalism, they often think of things like markets and trade and businesses. But markets and trade and businesses were around for thousands of years before capitalism and are innocent enough on their own. Right? Capitalism is only a 500-year-old system. What distinguishes it from other economic systems in human history is that it is organized around and dependent on ever-increasing levels of production, right? Constantly increasing production, which we measure in terms of GDP, and we euphemistically refer to this with the magic word growth. Okay? If the system doesn't grow, it literally crashes. It's deeply unstable and causes enormous social harm when this occurs. Now, crucially, under capitalism, the purpose of increasing production is not to meet concrete human needs or to achieve innovation or social progress or specific ecological goals, no. Rather, it is to extract and accumulate an ever-increasing quantity of profit. That is the overriding objective of production, right? And this process has no identifiable endpoints, and this is extraordinary. The dominant assumption in economics is that this should carry on indefinitely, that every industry, every sector, every national economy should continue to increase production, regardless of whether or not we actually need it to, right? Now, this might not be a problem if growth was just plucked out of thin air. But unfortunately, this is not the case. The empirical record is very clear that the more the economy produces, the more resources it uses. And this graph here shows global material use over the past half-century. And this is metals, cement, forests, fossil fuels, fish, everything the economy extracts and uses each year. The red line shows what industrial ecologists say is the maximum sustainable boundary. That's 50 billion tons of materials per year. And as you can see, we shot past this threshold in the late 1990s. And as of today, we're using around 100 billion tons per year, overshooting the maximum threshold by a factor of 2. And this is the key driver of ecosystem damage and biodiversity loss. And material use, in turn, is being driven by capital's pursuits of growth. There's a very tight coupling between GDP and material use. And for the past half-century, economists have promised that more efficient technology and a shift to services would decouple growth from resource use. But this has not occurred. And it's a problem, because, again, material use is the major driver of ecosystem damage and biodiversity loss. Now, crucially, and this is super important, excess resource use in the world economy is being driven overwhelmingly by rich countries. And here we have the same data, it's a bit difficult to see here, the same data showing material use by country income group. We see that the rich countries, which are on the far right, use an average of about 28 material tons of materials per person per year. That's 4 times over the maximum sustainable boundary. And by the way, it's also vastly in excess of what we know is required to provision good lives for everyone. In the Netherlands, material use is even higher, by the way. It's one of the highest in the world. Now, why is it, tell me, that rich countries, which have such extremely high levels of production, such extremely high levels of resource use, at the same time still have large numbers of their own citizens who cannot make ends meet, can't access affordable healthcare or transit or even nutritious food? 1 million people in the Netherlands live in food insecurity, right? The reason is because under capitalism, decisions about what to produce, how to use our productive capacities and our resources and our labor, and who benefits from the surplus that we generate, all of this is controlled by capital. And of course, for capital, the objective is to produce things that maximize their profits, things like advertising and SUVs and fossil fuels, rather than things like public health care and public transit and renewable energy and so on. And the result is that we have a system that simultaneously overuses resources and at the same time fails to meet people's basic needs. Okay? So meanwhile, by the way, lower income countries consume a very small quantity of materials and actually in most cases need to increase their use of materials in order to achieve human development objectives. Okay? Now, another thing we have to note here is that resource use in the world economy has clear colonial dimensions. And this is very important to me, and I'm going to try to explain it briefly. More than half of the excess material use in rich nations is net appropriated from the global south. Okay? So here's the key facts. Growth in the global north relies on this massive net appropriation of resources and goods from the territories of the global south. And this happens because northern states and their firms seek to depress the prices of labor and resources in the global south in order to maximize their profits. Okay? This is how capitalism works. Now, what this means is that for every unit of labor and resources embodied in the goods that the south imports from the north, they then have to export many more times to pay for it. Okay? And what this does is it generates a massive net flow of embodied labor and resources from the global south to the global north. Just to briefly give you a sense of the scale of this, in a single year, this is the most recent year of data we have, there was a net appropriation of 820 million hectares of embodied land, so land embodied in the production of goods. Okay? To put this in perspective, that is twice the size of India. That amount of land could be used to provide nutritious food for 4 to 6 billion people. But instead it is used to produce things like sugar for Coca-Cola and beef for McDonald's, consumed in the global north to the benefit of global north corporations. Okay? 21 exajoules of embodied energy is net appropriated from the South each year. That amount of energy would be enough to bring the entire population of the Global South up to a level of energy use sufficient to meet human needs at a high standard: universal healthcare, education, public transit, heating, cooling, electricity, good housing, computing, mobile phones, etc. But instead it's used to fuel growth and accumulation in the Global North. 188 million person-years of embodied labor is appropriated from the South each year. That's almost the size of Latin America's entire workforce. That labor could be used to staff hospitals and schools and produce food and goods for local needs, but instead they work full-time, year after year, churning out tech gadgets and fast fashion for multinational corporations. So this means that the South is deprived of the real resources that are necessary to meet human needs. Okay? In fact, this drain from the Global South is worth about 10.8 trillion US dollars per year, which would be enough to end global poverty 70 times over. But instead, this wealth is used to line the pockets of capital. But it also means, of course, that the social and ecological impacts of northern growth are offshored or externalized, is the word, to the Global South. That's where the damage happens, right? Southern ecosystems and communities are being plundered to support growthism in the north. So all of this is true when it comes to energy as well. GDP growth involves energy use. And here again, the inequalities are huge. High-income countries on the right, as you can see, use vastly more energy than would be required to provision good lives for everyone, which is represented by the black line, and obviously vastly more energy than the rest of the world. And again, this energy is being used to feed a production system that is controlled by the 1% and geared around maximizing profit and elite accumulation, not around human well-being. Okay? And as a result of this, high-income countries also have very high levels of emissions. In fact, we know that they are overwhelmingly responsible for the vast majority of excess emissions that are presently driving climate breakdown. So in a recent analysis, my colleagues and I found that the USA alone is responsible for 40% of emissions in excess of the safe planetary boundary. So that's 40% of all of the damages caused by climate breakdown all around the world. The Global North as a group, which includes the USA, but also Canada, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, and Japan, is responsible for 92%. And that's the area represented here by the dark green. Okay. Meanwhile, the entire continents of Africa and Asia and Latin America are responsible for only 8% of excess emissions, and that's the light green here. And most of the countries in the Global South, including countries like India and Indonesia, are still within their fair share of the safe planetary boundary, okay? So we need to understand this reality as a process of atmospheric colonization. The atmosphere is a shared commons on which all of us depend for our existence. And the Global North countries, and the rich in particular, have appropriated it for their own enrichments with devastating consequences for all of us and for all of life on Earth. Meanwhile, the Global South, which has done so little to cause the problem, suffers 82 to 92% of all of the costs of climate breakdown, and 98 to 99% of all climate-related deaths. So virtually all climate-related mortality is suffered in the territories of the Global South. It would be difficult, I think, to overstate the scale of the injustice that this represents. Okay, so what needs to happen? Well, clearly, this problem will not be solved with just a few more solar panels and a few more electric cars and keep everything else the same. This is a systemic crisis, and it requires systemic solutions. So let me try to explore this a little bit. First, we know that rich countries need to scale down their use of our planet's material resources by more than 50% from existing levels. Okay? Now, the existing discourse out there claims that this can be accomplished through green growth. And the idea here is efficiency improvements will allow us to achieve an absolute decoupling of GDP so that GDP keeps rising indefinitely into the bright future, while material use declines to sustainable levels. It sounds wonderful, but the problem is that scientists question the empirical validity of this narrative. And I think this is not seeped enough into our public discourse. Yes, efficiency improvements are vitally important. But in a growth-oriented economy, the gains from efficiency improvements are reinvested to expand the process of production, right? And so it makes it very difficult to achieve absolute reductions in material use. So for example, if you are Coca-Cola and you find a way to produce aluminum cans with 10% less metal, no? This is an efficiency improvement. What do you do with the savings? Is you invest in an advertising campaign or expanding production into other regions and into schools or whatever it might be. And so you're increasing production in total, and that makes most of the gains get wiped out. So the problem here is not our technology. Our technology is good. We should be proud of it. The problem is growth. And what this means is that if high-income nations are to achieve sufficient reductions in material use, then we need to abandon growth as an imperative. In a post-growth scenario, efficiency improvements would in fact work as we expect them to and deliver reductions in material use, okay? Okay, so what about climate? Let's talk about this. Now remember, to stay under 1.5 degrees, we need to cut emissions to 0 by 2050. We all agree. And high-income nations, given their disproportionate share of historical responsibility, have an obligation under the Paris Agreement to decarbonize faster, and this is the equity principle, okay? Now, emissions are different from materials. We know it is possible to absolutely decouple GDP from emissions by transitioning simply to lower carbon energy sources. And indeed, more than a dozen high-income nations have already been on this path, right? Even when we measure emissions in consumption-based terms. Now, this fact has been used widely, this got a bit messed up, sorry, has been used widely to argue that not only is green growth possible, but it's already here. And this is an article from the Financial Times a few weeks ago, okay? So you can see Denmark, Sweden, the UK. Oh, by the way, the Netherlands is also one of these decouplers, rising GDP with declining emissions at 1.4% decline per year, okay? Now, what this discourse obscures is that none of these nations, including the Netherlands, are reducing emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, okay? Not even the highest performing countries like Denmark and the UK, et cetera, right? They're way off. In the Netherlands, existing emissions reductions on our existing trend, it will take 200 years to reach net zero. And we'll blow through our fair share, I'm saying our like I'm from the Netherlands, this is cool. We'll blow through our fair share of the carbon budget 7 times over, right? There's nothing green about this. These are all inadequate. So the question becomes, is it possible to achieve sufficiently rapid decarbonization, right? Or do we just become doomers and give up? No, it is possible. But not if high-income nations continue to pursue growthism at the same time. And the reason is, again, because more growth requires more energy use than would otherwise be the case. And this makes rapid decarbonization more difficult to achieve, okay? So it makes our jobs harder, and why would we do that to ourselves? Proponents of green growth, by the way, just briefly, they understand this problem. And the way they tend to solve it is by gambling on the possibility of speculative negative emissions technologies. The idea is that in the future, the younger generation will devise ways to pull carbon back out of the atmosphere. And so we don't have to worry about stopping emissions now. We'll emit over our temperature thresholds and then put it on the youth to sort of solve this problem in the future, right? This has all sorts of problems that scientists reject quite vehemently. The main thing is that if this strategy was to fail for any social or political or technological reason, which is highly likely to do, then we will be locked into a hothouse trajectory from which it will be impossible for us to escape, right? So it's a massive gamble with the future of human civilization and all of life on Earth, all to defend continued economic growth in the global north, which is not even necessary. And I think we need to reckon with that. So in its latest report, the IPCC points out that scholarship on degrowth offers an alternative path. Now, degrowth research embraces efficiency improvements and embraces technological innovation, okay? But it recognizes that this alone will not be enough, and therefore calls on rich nations to also abandon GDP growth as an objective in and of itself, and scale down less necessary forms of production, okay? So what does this look like in practice? It's quite simple. Instead of assuming that every sector of the economy must grow all the time, regardless of whether or not we actually need it to, we should decide democratically what sectors we actually need to increase, things like renewable energy and public transit and access to affordable housing, right? And what sectors are clearly destructive and should be scaled down. Things like SUV production, private jets, air travel, fast fashion, industrial beef, cruises, advertising, the widespread practice of planned obsolescence, the military-industrial complex, right, and so on. There are clearly huge chunks of the economy that are organized mostly around corporate profits and power and elite consumption, and we don't need them. Now, this approach is powerful in terms of climate mitigation because it would significantly reduce energy use and therefore enable us to have a much faster transition to renewables, okay? Fast enough to stay under 1.5 degrees. Now, most people would regard this as sensible, right? Except for one obvious sticking point. What about jobs? What about livelihoods? As we scale down less necessary forms of economic activity, then won't that lead to unemployment? And if so, clearly this is politically untenable. And nobody would agree to such a future, and nobody should, okay? Fortunately, ecological economists propose a simple solution. If the economy requires less labor to produce the things that we do need, then we can shorten the working week and share necessary labor more evenly, right? Thus preventing any unemployment and taking any benefits in terms of increased leisure time, which has strong positive benefits for society. We can also roll out a climate job guarantee. This is an important one. A program like this would ensure that anyone who wants to can train to participate in the most important collective projects of our generation, right? Building renewable energy capacity, insulating homes, producing local food, regenerating ecosystems. This permanently ends unemployment and allows us to mobilize labor around socially necessary objectives rather than around corporate profits, right? So it allows us to shift our productive capacities around things that we really do need, objectives we really want to achieve in a short period of time. At the same time, we need to decommodify essential goods and expand universal public services. And here I mean not just the typical ones like healthcare and education, but also universal affordable housing, public transits, clean energy, right? Water, internet, nutritious food. Taking this approach ensures that essential goods are always going to be produced and everyone will have access to them regardless of whether there are fluctuations in aggregate output, right? And right now, again, if you have a recession in the economy, people lose their access to these things because their access is mediated entirely by wages. And so decommodification becomes critically important here. On top of this, we need to dramatically reduce inequality and distribute income more fairly. And this is really key. People often ask me this interesting question. They say, will there be enough income in a degrowth scenario to meet human needs? And the answer to this is interesting. The answer is yes, but not just yes, by definition, yes, okay? Because national income is simply by definition equal to the total prices of all of the stuff that is produced in the economy, okay? It's an accounting identity. There's always exactly enough income to buy everything the economy produces. So therefore, as long as we are producing what people need, there's always, by definition, enough income to buy those things, so long as the income is distributed fairly. Distribution is everything here, right? So taking this approach, establishing a firm social guarantee and sharing resources more fairly would allow us to ensure decent livelihoods for all, delinking human well-being from economic growth. This ends the growth imperative. It breaks the political logjam around climate action. Right now, we cannot pursue radical climate action because it might have harmful effects on employment and livelihoods. But by taking the question of employment and livelihoods off the table, by permanently solving that question, right, we can pursue radical climate action without anyone getting hurt. This is the bread and butter of a just transition. We need to have policies like this. Now, I briefly also want to emphasize that the demand for degrowth is not just about ecology. It's also an anti-colonial demand. Degrowth scholarship calls for an end to the colonial patterns of appropriation that underpin northern capital accumulation, to release the global south from the grip of extractivism and from a future of catastrophic climate breakdown. Southern countries should be free to organize their resources and their labor around meeting human needs rather than around servicing northern growthism. Degrowth, in other words, is an anti-colonial demand, a demand for decolonization. And this thinking is actually is reflected clearly today in the People's Agreements of Cochabamba, which was signed in 2010 by thousands of social movements from across the global south, and I urge you to read it if you have not done so yet. So we know empirically that with measures like these, we can achieve a rapid reduction in emissions, consistent with staying under 1.5 degrees, while at the same time reversing other forms of ecological breakdown. Global warming would stop. The land would regenerate. Biodiversity would bounce back. Our planet would heal. And best of all, we do this while improving social outcomes, right? Organizing our productive capacities around human needs and well-being and ecology, rather than around capital accumulation. This is incredibly hopeful news. It's a powerful antidote, I think, to the depression and anxiety and doomerism that has seeped into our culture. But we have to be clear. This will not happen by itself. Okay? It requires a significant shift in mentality. For decades, we've been told that if we care about the environment, we have to focus on individual behavior change. But this is clearly not adequate. We need to transition out of capitalism to a post-capitalist, post-growth economy, one that is capable of ensuring good lives for all within planetary boundaries. And to get there, we need to build a political movement that is powerful enough to unseat existing incumbents or otherwise force them to change course. The environmentalist movements cannot do this on its own. To be effective, it must create alliances with unions and working-class political formations, which have much more political leverage, including the power of the strike. And for this, it is vital that we foreground the demands for social justice that I've highlighted here. Now, yes, of course, such a movement would encounter stiff resistance from those who benefit so prodigiously from the existing arrangement of this economy. But so has every struggle for a better world, and that should not deter us. Thank you very much.